Good afternoon and welcome to this webcast, Finding ROSA, Return on Supplier Assets, Valuing and Managing Suppliers Strategically, brought to you by Institute for Supply Management and sponsored by Zycus. I'm your moderator, John Yuva. Thanks for joining us. Before getting started, let's cover a few administrative items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets for your convenience. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. Any questions we're unable to address during the webcast will be answered later via email. A copy of today's slide deck is available on the resource list widget that resembles a green folder at the bottom of your screen. To expand your slide area, click on the maximize icon on the top right or drag the bottom right corner of the slide area. If you have any technical difficulties, click on the help widget that resembles a question mark for answers to common technical issues. Today's presenters are Richard Waugh, Vice President for Corporate Development at Zycus. Richard leads strategic initiatives in the areas of new product introduction, market development, thought leadership, analyst relations, and strategic partner development. Garry Christie is Director of Global Business Services for Advanced Micro Devices. In this role, he is responsible for the strategic sourcing, purchasing, and supplier management of AMD's worldwide indirect spend. Garry has extensive domestic and global experience in positions with multinational tech companies. He has led teams across all aspects of supply chain with experience and knowledge in all disciplines, including master planning, sourcing, logistics, sales and operations planning, and customer and supplier relationship management. Today's seminar will focus on supplier diversity and how to move beyond program goals to maximize value contribution, measuring supplier scorecards and knowing the right KPIs, and understanding effective collaboration and evaluation mechanisms to make the procurement and supplier partnership rewarding for all parties. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, John. Pleasure to join you today, and I'm really excited as well to be joined by Garry Christie, whose bio you just covered, and we'll utilize his expertise liberally throughout the presentation. We'll be having a chance to ask the expert, and Garry is certainly the expert, as we've seen from his bio, on this topic of supplier management. And just before we start, just to provide a little bit of context, Zycus, we are a solution provider of an integrated suite of source-to-pay software tools. So without going into any great detail, those cover a number of disciplines across source-to-pay, spend analytics, sourcing, contract management, operational procurement in the case of procure-to-pay, as well as the ability to track and monitor how those savings matriculate to the financial statements through financial savings management. But the piece we're going to focus on today is around supplier management, so in gold in this particular diagram, and wanted to just preview a little bit for our audience today the agenda that we have planned. So again, our topic is finding ROSA. In this case, ROSA is going to be your return on supplier assets. So it's about changing the mindset to think about suppliers as assets to the business. So how do we value and manage those suppliers more strategically? And I wanted to start off at the very highest level, just sharing some information, some of recent studies in the marketplace that highlight why is supplier management a strategic focus for many businesses. And we'll segue into then a discussion of, all suppliers bring assets to the table, but of course they're not all valued equally. And one of the best practices is a supplier segmentation and rationalization approach. We'll talk through those best practices. And then we'll get at what's a little bit tougher to quantify in some cases around supplier management as compared to other initiatives across sourcing and procurement, like sourcing or procure-to-pay, that have a very clear and tangible ROI. It's how do we measure and quantify the productivity and performance enhancement opportunity by focusing on supplier management. And part of that, too, then, is what key performance indicators should I use to rate and rank supplier performance? What can it tell me about how to address any issues or really have sort of advanced notification of where there may be issues with a particular supplier? And that really leads us into a discussion of supply risk and how is supply risk most effectively managed. And at the conclusion, we'll try to give you a glimpse of what does the future of supplier collaboration look like, especially with best of breed or sort of leading edge tools to enable better insights to suppliers. So that's the agenda for today. Wanted to start off with then, again, this high-level view of why is supplier management a strategic priority across the business. So this is from a study that the Hackett Group's done around key issues in procurement for 2016. And a lot of data points plotted across this grid that really highlight a number of strategic priorities. So nothing new to any of the folks on our audience today. There's so much on the plate, whether it's reducing spend, increasing procurement's influence, all those kinds of things. And this also demonstrates that organizations have different levels of capability that they feel across the spectrum. I'll just highlight the ones in red. Areas where there's strategic value, they're highly important, but most organizations feel they have limited ability to address those today. And included there, of course, elevating the role of procurement to a trusted advisor, increasing spend influence, improving agility, but specific to our discussion today, tapping that supplier innovation. How do I make the most of those supplier assets that are available to me? And the other cut that Hackett took at this in the key issue study then is what are the capabilities that procurement specifically has to focus on to be able to accomplish more of their key priorities and goals. So included amongst category management, talent management, are supplier relationship management. So it's clearly a high priority, but relatively less mature from a capability standpoint for most organizations. So, and of course we've got a twofer today because the good news is there are procurement software tools that can help with supplier relationship management. So clearly this is on the radar screen for procurement leaders and the reason for our topic today. One other parallel or analogy that I just wanted to draw here is when you look at the supplier relationship management process, it really very closely mirrors or resembles the sell side of the equation or customer relationship management. So looking at SRM, for example, it usually starts with a category management focus, much the way on the sales side you'd really analyze your market. Here you're analyzing a category and the supply base that supports it. So going through supplier discovery and really building a pipeline the same way a salesperson does of capable suppliers to go to market through a negotiation process, contracting, onboarding those suppliers, and then managing them over a full life cycle, really having a continuous end-to-end approach of managing that supplier relationship. So every bit as detailed and complex as the sales cycle, which is its mirror image, but generally speaking, a little less formalized, and generally speaking as well, fewer tools and resources have historically been deployed to help supply management grapple with the complexity of SRM to the same extent that the tools and resources have historically been available on the sales side. And that's in spite of the fact that I think you can make a case that the complexity is in fact much greater from a supply management standpoint. So whereas sales teams typically have a distinct geographic focus, many organizations have global category managers that have to look across the globe and different segments of the supply base and how they serve their business globally. Not only that, if you look at a data point here from CAP's research that looked in the manufacturing industry, on average, a supply management FTE is managing about $17 million in spend. That would be a pretty hefty quota for a salesperson. And also that span of control is pretty massive, 122 active suppliers per supply management FTE on average. So the magnitude of the challenge seems pretty significant and really begs for advanced techniques as well as tools to help in the discipline of supplier management. So I wanted to segue then into a discussion about, as you look at your supply base, and for most large enterprises that typically consist of thousands, if not tens of thousands of suppliers. So again, the challenge is pretty daunting, and it really cries out for a segmentation approach. And I bring up this visual here of the Krajlic model, Peter Krajlic, who published this way back in 1983. But it's clearly stood the test of time. It's kind of used as the classic approach to supplier segmentation with these four quadrants. And the axes, of course, distinguishing between the profit potential or profit impact for those products and suppliers as low to high, as well as the supply risk or criticality. So if you look at the four quadrants, leverage products clearly represent a significant opportunity for strategic sourcing because they return and have a big profit impact, but are relatively speaking lower risk and lower complexity to source. Kind of going left to right, the strategic quadrant, especially areas where organizations like Garry's at AMD will focus around supplier performance measurement, because these strategic suppliers have not only a high profit impact, but they're relatively higher risk, more complex from a sourcing and relationship management standpoint. The quadrant on the lower right, bottleneck, is really sort of a difficult place to be, because not only is the profit improvement potential relatively low, but it's a pretty complex, difficult to source, high risk component. So generally speaking, the strategy is to try to move suppliers out of that particular quadrant into another one. And the last one, routine products, standard commodities, don't have a big profit impact and are relatively less complex. And there it's a transactional focus, so tools like procure to pay to simply take the friction out of the transaction process for those particular items. So this is the classic Krajlic model. And this is my opportunity, first one, to ask the expert, Garry, be interested in your case. How have you applied or maybe adapted this model in segmenting suppliers in your business at AMD?
Sure, Richard. Thanks for inviting me to join you on the webinar today, and I'm happy to share what we do at AMD in this very, very important area for the procurement and sourcing teams. So the answer is, yes, we have. I mean, segmentation, supplier segmentation has been an integral part of the strategic sourcing process here at AMD for a number of years. And so if I look at the Krajlic model and say how have we adapted it, so we do our segmentation on an annual basis. So every year, towards the end of the year, all of the commodity managers in our teams around the world, they do a segmentation exercise, and that involves a couple of things. So one is we take our spend data from our analytics tool, so we've got a very good visibility into who we spend money with, what we spend money on. So we use our spend data, and then we built a scorecard which everyone uses, and it covers things like risk assessment, the value to AMD, social responsibility, a number of areas. So it's a standard process that every single sourcing manager runs this in a year. And there's three tiers from an output that we take from this in terms of how we then tier our suppliers. Our top tier is what we call strategic. The mid tier is transformational, and the lower tier is operational. So we end up with our three tiers. When we think of strategic, the type of key parameters that lend themselves to being a strategic supplier, things such as the products and services provided by that supplier, are they integral to AMD success? Right? How integral are they? We look at the relationship. We look at those suppliers, and even a lot of suppliers that we have a long-term relationship with. We take that into account. We do look at the spend number. We also look at the replacement cost. What is the cost of replacement? Should we have to move to another supply base? We look at the source of supply. If it's a limited source of supply, then that's certainly something we take into account. And then the last two things is we really value collaboration from a supplier perspective. So we look at that. Do we have a high collaboration model? And then on innovation, does that supplier, the innovation they provide to the goods or services that we get from them, do they help to make AMD competitive? So absolutely, we apply this model. It's adapted in the way we use it. It's a standard process we use across the world, and it's I would say for any company for SRM, you have to do a segmentation process. It's really, really important. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Gary. So it definitely sounds like a very rigorous and frequently renewed process to continue to measure those suppliers against the variables and place them in the three-tier approach so that you really know where they fit in terms of the importance to your business. So that's extremely helpful. So segmentation then, of course, sort of also dovetails into the idea of, well, how many suppliers is the right number? How do I right-size the supply base? And again, I'm going to lean on some benchmark data from the Hackett Group, which I think is pretty interesting. They break out between best-in-class, world-class, or non-world-class organizations along direct, indirect, and of course overall supply baselines. And not surprisingly, the number of direct material suppliers is usually a much more concentrated and finite number. And one of the big challenges in terms of potentially having too many suppliers or a proliferation of suppliers usually falls on the indirect side, where you see the numbers are much higher. But just looking at the overall average between direct and indirect, I think it's very revealing the magnitude of the difference between what Hackett identifies as world-class performers and everyone else, essentially the non-world-class. The fact that you've got, about 6,000 vendors on average per billion in spend for the average organization, and the best performers have already rationalized the supply base down by a factor of about 2/3 to only about 2,000 suppliers per billion. And again, my chance to ask the expert, and by the way, everyone will have their chance to ask you questions as well, Gary, through typing in questions in the Q&A chat. But when you look at the size of your supply base, and what methods do you use to really determine what's the optimal size? Where do you need to potentially rationalize further?
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Richard. Direct is very different from indirect. At AMD, a semiconductor company, there's a very rigorous qualification process in the direct side. So by definition, almost then that's how you find the number of suppliers. It's really through those who are qualified to bring the products that we need and it clearly fit into the world class. Within the indirect space, which is the area that I lead, the method we use to look at this is again go back to using our analytics tool. You have to know who you're spending money with, what you're spending it on. So you need a base before you can really take a look at this and determine where you sit. So we have that information. We look at it every month. We load our data, so we know who we're spending money with. We'll talk a little bit later about the 80-20 rule, which is what we in AMD consider to be of higher value when we look at our supply base. So we sit just above the world class here because we've determined that we're good with the number of suppliers that we have and how we manage it, and that's really attributable to the fact that we have the data, and so by having that data, we feel comfortable with where we are in terms of our total supplier number and supplier per $1 billion spend. And this is a really good metric. I think to look at this is good. there's economies of scale. As you've got a low spend, then it's, you're going to end up with a higher number. So the higher your spend, and the easier it is to drive it down. But I think in terms of all the supplier count metrics that are out there, I think this one aligned with the 80-20 split are two good complementary metrics to look at when measuring your supply base. And one thing I'd mention here also from an indirect is it depends what you have with an indirect. So, for example, we at AMD don't have a lot of spend with MRO or office equipment. So I think that has an influence on again, the number of suppliers you use and where your opportunities are. But again, it comes back to make sure that you know your spend data, and from that you can then determine your strategy and approach.
Great point, Gary. If you've got your spend accurately classified and categorized, you can quickly drill in to a specific category and maybe see, I've got 80 vendors for this particular category. That's clearly too many, and set a target for rationalization from there. And you also teed up for us the 80-20 rule. So in terms of rationalizing supply base, that those real tail suppliers, long tail suppliers, may be difficult to rationalize initially, but a strategy that's been effective, especially, is to go after that 20% of the vendors that constitute 80% of the spend, and really rationalize in that area. And here, some different benchmarks from Ardent Partners in this case, and their data suggests that on average, the average organization has about 22% of suppliers that account for 80% of the total spend. So pretty close to the classic 80-20 rule. Some interesting comparisons in the case of the Ardent Partners benchmarks as well between best in class and all others. So best in class are doing a little bit better than 80-20, so about 19% account for 80% of the spend, but they're also pushing the envelope on electronically enabling their suppliers to do a better job of collaboration. So closer relationships with fewer suppliers at the end of the day, and they've got about 37% of their suppliers enabled. The one data point here that almost looks like an anomaly is best in class say they think they've got 8.4% of their suppliers that are high risk, and the average performers, all others, say only about 5.6% of suppliers that they would qualify as high risk. And, one of the things I would postulate for the difference in that is not necessarily that best in class has more risky suppliers than everyone else. It may just be that they're more vigilant about measuring and addressing and therefore mitigating supply risk than the others. But while we're on this topic, Gary, a few different questions for you. How do you approach rationalization, number one? And the follow-ups would be, to what extent are you focusing on enabling suppliers electronically, and how do you determine, in your case, which suppliers you'd assess as higher risk?
Yeah, thanks. Three really good questions. So let's start with the first one in terms of supplier rationalization. So as I mentioned previously, our focus, we look at both metrics, our total supplier count per spend and also the 80-20. In our approach is to aggregate our spend, leverage it wherever we can. That's across categories and across regions. And the focus really is on this, where does the area of our spend go? And I'm delighted to say that with an AMD, it's a much lower percentage of supply base that accounts for 80% of the spend in the indirect area. We're really focused on that so that we can leverage everywhere we can. So that's a key focus for us. That when I think of rationalization, it's not necessarily, again, cutting off the tail, although again I'd love to hear from others about their approach. We focus on making sure that we leverage as much spend as we can with a relatively small number of suppliers. So that's sort of approach to rationalization. Electronic enabling is not being a core strategy for us. We look at a lot of our spend that goes via ERS. We have a supplier portal in place. But it's not really been a huge focus in our area of where we go. Maybe somewhere we go next, but it's not been an area we've really tackled the same as we have in other aspects of supplier relationship management. And then on high risk, and again, the nature of the semiconductor industry is that it's really difficult to design and manufacture the products that we sell. So the high risk does tend to be more focused on the direct spend area. So we build on the segmentation process that was done where we identify our strategic and transformational suppliers. And with all of those suppliers in the direct spend area, we perform another assessment, which allows us to determine where we have the highest risk. And then we work with those suppliers, smaller subset of our total, to understand those issues to a greater depth, and then work and agree mitigation plans where necessary. And I completely agree with your comment, Richard, on the numbers. I think it's the higher percentage because there are companies out there, those best in class, who are paying more attention and have put mechanisms in place with their suppliers and their suppliers to allow them to get a better handle on it. And it very much is dependent on the industry you work in. I was recently at a conference with peers that work in non-high tech type industries, and they've got some real good initiatives in place about how they measure what they perceive high risk to be. So it's a growing area for procurement and sourcing teams to be aware of, and I think we're going to see the number may increase because, as you said, companies are going to get better at measuring high risk and therefore being able to do something about it.
Right. Today, it may be a case of we don't know what we don't know. And as the discipline emerges and the tools that support it, we may actually find the risk assessments going up, but the effective plans for mitigating and addressing it also becoming more robust. So that's a great perspective, Garry. And we've talked a lot about the magnitude of the challenge of managing the supply base, techniques for rationalizing. I want to talk about the process for a moment, specifically how you onboard suppliers. We have a very involved diagram here, and I won't go through it in any excruciating detail, but it really means, first of all, gathering information from suppliers, really having identified what attributes, what criteria do you need to gather from a supplier? Do you need to understand about their process quality standards and certifications? What kind of documentation do you need to assemble? Things like certificates of insurance or W-9s and those kinds of things. And then, be going through a review process from a procurement, from a commodity manager role, let's say, but then other functional stakeholders often getting involved in the business as well, whether that's the finance or legal group to look at regulatory or compliance concerns. For the more strategic suppliers, that may include a quality or again, compliance officer or staff member that scrutinizes the details up to and including perhaps a site visit with the suppliers. So lots of moving parts here and lots of steps. So I wanted to get a sense, again, Garry, from you as the expert, how does your supplier onboarding process compare to this workflow diagram, and where do you typically see bottlenecks in the process?
Thanks, Richard. So in terms of compare, I need to distinguish between the direct and indirect. So, in the direct space, as I alluded to earlier, qualifying new suppliers is a very, very rigorous process. We're looking right now at potentially even qualifying a new facility, a new manufacturing facility, an existing supplier. So we go through a very a very robust process with the site visits, etc., that would be involved there. And those are again infrequent. It's not as though we're bringing a new direct supplier on board every month. So in the direct process, it's similar to this to the extent that there's a lot of work done in the qualification side. Within the indirect space, the supply, and that's where we bring more suppliers on. So, ideally we don't want to bring a lot of new suppliers on board, and we, procurement has to improve every time we bring on a new supplier. But we understand that there are reasons that our stakeholders, have a specific requirement to bring on a supplier that can support a specific need that they have. And so from that, I would say the process is not as complex as we show here, because again, from a risk perspective, we don't believe that the risk is as high as, for example, qualifying a new direct supplier. So what we do at AMD is, we have an onboarding form which is completed by all suppliers who we wish to onboard. We've looked to simplify that process. One of the key focus areas at AMD from our CEO down is to simplify the business everywhere we can. So we actually looked at our form and our process in 2015, and we improved it such that we really have eliminated any of the process bottlenecks. And it's not always been that way. We tried a couple of years ago to move to much more of a kind of self-service model with our suppliers, but it really proved that the onboarding form, the online boarding form, the questions were too complex. It was cumbersome. Smaller suppliers just really struggled with it, and we ended up getting several escalations actually to senior execs from unhappy stakeholders and suppliers. So we work really closely with the finance team on this, and so we work with them. We modify their approach. I say last year actually streamlined the process to make it even more efficient. So very similar to what you have here. We don't include all the steps for all suppliers, particularly in the indirect space, but we're happy with the process that we use, and say we've got it to the stage that we believe is a very efficient process without incurring undue risk to the company.
Excellent perspective. Thanks, Garry. And when there's a process like this, and as you say, there's some variability, whether it's direct or indirect, it may not include on the indirect side every step, but clearly for most organizations, there are multiple stakeholders involved, so there's a cost to this process in terms of the effort that's being expended across the organization from a cross-functional standpoint to manage suppliers. So that kind of begs the question, what is the potential business case? What is the cost of managing suppliers, and what is the potential opportunity? We're all about simplification, just as you say, and hopefully using more intuitive technologies and tools to help streamline and simplify the supplier onboarding and ongoing management of suppliers as well. And here's some data that comes courtesy of the folks at Spend Matters, who actually really put together a report to try to tackle this question, which has been somewhat elusive. How do I create a hard dollar business case around supplier management? Some interesting data points that they've accumulated here as they look at the cross-functional cost of supplier information management, just as we walk through in that process flow, whether that's the commodity managers, legal, finance, quality, compliance officers, different folks who have to touch this process. They say on average it's between $150 and $225 per supplier per year. So you do the math and you extrapolate that over, again, thousands or potentially tens of thousands of suppliers, and that's a significant cost to the organization. Now, deploying automation tools around supplier information management has been shown to produce productivity benefits up to 20%. So that roughly equates to, on average, about $30 to $40 per supplier. And then if I look at that over a supply base of about 10,000 suppliers, annualized potential savings of $300,000 to $400,000. Now that's not always counted as a hard dollar benefit, because usually that means freeing up supply management FTEs to do less data gathering around supplier information, getting the suppliers to provision more of that on your behalf, and do more strategic things like risk management, supplier performance measurement, etc. So just to give a quick glimpse as to what some of the tools around supplier information management can enable from a best practice standpoint is, number one, getting all this information in one centralized database, and being able to offload more of the effort to the suppliers themselves, to get them to load their profiles and upload and keep up to date their documentation and insurance certificates and the like, but still maintain control within the supply management function through a workflow process to vet that suppliers and the information that they've provisioned before those vendors are added to the master file. And being able to watch out for things like making sure you're doing business with only those suppliers that you need to, and you're not adding duplicate vendors to the vendor master. You're not onboarding suppliers that may be on a blacklist, for example, and ultimately then keeping that information in sync with the vendor master or supplier master in the ERP system of record. And last but not least, a real benefit that suppliers see to engaging with you through this portal is getting more visibility themselves. For instance, from a transactional perspective, being able to track their invoice approval and payment status, or being able to review the current scorecard that you've produced on their performance as well. And that's what I want to talk about next, actually, supplier performance management, some of the best practices in that case. So here it's the idea of producing those scorecards, the classic red, yellow, green view of how is a supplier performing according to my specific key performance indicators, and really being able to take a holistic view of supplier performance then from a quantitative standpoint, things like on-time delivery or quality defects or cost, but also from a more qualitative perspective, things like end-user surveys of how they would rate supplier performance, and being able to roll that all up, and not just to be able to produce an aggregate supplier scorecard. So it's not always that meaningful to have one score for a supplier, because that supplier may be doing multiple projects across multiple categories for different business units, divisions, plants, projects, down to a part level. So having the flexibility to look at that really avoids what I've heard referred to as the watermelon scorecard syndrome, which is everything's green, but there are a lot of red faces. And that's because, the scorecards maybe when you're looking at just an aggregate view of supplier performance, you're not able to drill into down to a project or a plant or a part level where things may be going awry. So really looking at how automation can give you better visibility to supplier performance is a strategic initiative and best practice as well. So on that topic of what do you measure then? What are the key KPIs used in supplier performance measurement? So again, this comes from the CAPS Research Manufacturing Industry benchmark, and pretty much universally, manufacturers, for instance, are measuring things like on-time delivery, total cost of ownership, quality is measured in defects per million parts, for example, and oftentimes as well delving into things like innovation, like continuous improvement in quality management or risk mitigation initiative that the supplier is putting in place on my behalf, as well as an item that you alluded to, Gary, earlier, sub-tier supplier management. So how effective is my supplier at managing the lower tiers throughout the supply chain? So that's kind of an interesting glimpse to what some key performance indicators are in putting together a scorecard initiative, as well as then how frequently do you look at that. So with more automation, of course, there's an opportunity to have a more frequent calculation of supplier performance, and that's going to give you the ability to remediate where necessary more quickly for those items. So again, Gary, I wanted to ask the expert, which KPIs do you measure, which suppliers do you scorecard, and how frequently do you measure them?
Thanks, Richard. So let me take the last two questions first and then come back to the KPI question. So in terms of which suppliers we measure, it goes back to where we started with the segmentation process. I say we go through our annual segmentation, we identify our strategic and transformational suppliers, and so those are the suppliers that we measure. You know, we've determined that they're important enough that we want to have a measurement on all of these suppliers. So we build it from the segmentation process, which is why that's critical to what you do with supplier performance management. So our strategic and transformational suppliers are the ones we use. And our guidelines are our strategic suppliers, that are kind of top suppliers. Then we do a quarterly measurement, and with transformational, it's twice a year. So, you know, it takes time and effort to do it, but we've considered that it's important enough that we have those levels of measurement in place. So that answers the question regarding which suppliers and how frequently. So let's go back to the KPIs. So it's very consistent with what you show here. Really no surprise to that. But get into a little bit more detail of what we do at AMD. So we have 5 areas of focus. So at a high level, the KPIs fit within one of these 5 areas. We call it TQCFS, and it's technology, quality, cost, flexibility, and service. We have multiple questions within each of those high-level areas. And those questions, those KPIs, they're updated each year in line with our segmentation process, and we share any changes with the suppliers before the performance period starts. It's very, very important that we make our suppliers aware of what they're being measured on before they actually go into that period, so that they've got a clear understanding of anything they have to do to accommodate, to make sure that they're able to deliver the highest level of performance possible against what we're going to measure. So again, splitting into direct and indirect. So for direct, the questions are pretty consistent across the total supply base. The nature of what we do with our suppliers in that space means that the questions, on-time delivery, etc., are the standard questions that we put in place. With indirect, we used to do that. We used to view that consistency was really key in terms of asking everyone the same questions. But what we learned from that was that it really wasn't proven to be as effective as we would like, in the sense that we ended up measuring suppliers with KPIs that really were not that relevant to the goods or services they were providing. And as a result, then both the supplier and the stakeholders, they really struggle to buy into the process. And this can only be a successful process if you have complete buy-in from your supplier and your stakeholders, both in terms of scoring and the reviews. So we changed our approach. This was a bottoms-up feedback that came from our sourcing leads who were running these reviews, and they said, we have to do something different here. And so what we've done is our sourcing leads, they work with our stakeholders and suppliers, and we make the KPIs really relevant for the work that the supplier is doing. We maintain consistency within our categories, but we really focus on them so that, we won't necessarily cover all 5 areas, for example, or we'll have much higher weighting towards one of the areas than others. But it's really tailored. the KPIs are really tailored in the indirect space and the categories of suppliers that we are measuring. And that has worked out really, really well. The supplier reviews we hold in the indirect space are they're really driving value, and they're proving to be integral to our strategic sourcing process. So a little bit of a change, a modification that we did there, and we feel very good about how that change has resulted in improving those reviews and ultimately then improving the supplier performance.
Yeah, and supplier performance measurement, Gary, it's clear that this is an area that you're in the vanguard in at AMD, and you shared a number of compelling insights. I was wondering if you just kind of summarize for us in this case study walkthrough, kind of where did you start and how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. So when I joined AMD, supply performance management was operating well within the direct space, but not within indirect, and that was no surprise. For most companies, certainly, going back 3 or 4 years, that was the case. It lends itself well to those kind of on-time delivery, quality issues, etc., that you have with direct suppliers, but a little less tangible within the indirect space. And so, how do you make it really successful? And you also, as we looked at it from a technology, this is where technology can really help. That the tool that we had, which was an in-house tool, it was really old. It was an application that was no longer actively being supported by IT. It made it difficult to actually hold those scores, get the scoring done, work with the suppliers, work with the stakeholders. People really were unhappy with the process. So what we did is we invested in some technology. We said, yep, this is an area where it is really important to us, but we need to make some level of investment in order to make it easier for people to be able to do the scoring, provide feedback, create their improvement plans. So we did that. We made that investment. We moved. We rolled that out across the global organization. I mean, we literally rolled it out from the start of a particular calendar year. We're now using this new tool. It worked really, really well. The scorecard questions were easily repeated, so it made it so the efficiency gain that we got from moving to this was significant, not only for the folks within the procurement, but also with the stakeholders and our suppliers. Our suppliers could start to work with the data. They could start to create those improvement plans, which is the essential output of every review you're going to hold. They could do. They can provide feedback to us. They can provide feedback to us about what are the things that we can do to help be that customer of choice. What can we do to allow them to be more successful in helping AMD? So when you look down at the impact, I say the efficiency and information sharing, again, you got to use the right technology to allow this to be successful, and you got to make that investment to make it happen, and it's more than worth it in terms of the end result that you get. So process efficiency, information sharing. We could really focus in on the feedback that we can provide to suppliers. They can understand that we have the dialogue. They know, and by the time we hold the reviews, yet the score's there, but it's more about what's driving behind the scores. And ultimately, it's allowed us in indirect as well as direct, where supplier innovation is a critical thing for our suppliers to really find ways of how they can differentiate their levels of performance. And we've been able, through using this tool, through using this process, to allow suppliers to be able to bring more back to the table for AMD, which ultimately results in win-win type of situations. So we feel very good. We're always challenging ourselves in terms of how we do better, but the process, the efficiency, the tools we use, we feel good about what we do today here at AMD.
Well, thanks, Gary. And you mentioned supplier innovation, which is really that next frontier, I think, for a lot of organizations. As procurement, of course, we're always focused on cost, productivity, cost reduction, and those kinds of things. But so many organizations today are saying, how do I get the next wave of value creation beyond cost reduction, and including really a top-line revenue potential that can come from procurement-led supplier collaboration and supplier innovation. I think, and particularly in your case in the high-tech industry, I thought this was an interesting statistic from the Aberdeen Group. They're saying that on average, new products account for almost half of revenues in the high-tech industry because new product introduction and product life cycles are so short. And just wanted to pull up this data point as well from the Hackett Group, where they've indicated that on average, organizations can account for about 3.5% of total revenues coming from supplier innovation, but the top performers are actually double that, more than double that, about 7.4%. So I wanted to, again, get your perspective. What methods do you use to quantify supplier innovation? How do you reward those suppliers? And something you already addressed a little bit, how do you then become customer of choice?
Thanks, Richard. So yeah, very much building on what I was speaking to within the case study. So in terms of how we quantify, there's a couple of ways. So firstly, it's included within our KPIs. It's included there. Suppliers know that's an expectation of them in terms of how they want to differentiate themselves in terms of performance. So that's an incentive itself in terms of suppliers wanting to continue to improve their performance over each consecutive period. So it's there, it's known from day one. And we take that into consideration, when we're rewarding suppliers who are consistently innovating for the benefit of AMD. Those are the companies that we want to grow our business with. It's very much in our interest to see them grow with us. So, ultimately their reward is that as new business opportunities appear, then the fact that they've been able to innovate and find ways to help AMD be successful, then that's absolutely taken into account when we go through those different sourcing events. And then from a dollar value, some are easier than others. It's more on a cost down, I would say, than on the revenue side. But we absolutely quantify in terms of going through the process about how much from a dollar perspective we're able to say that the different innovations have allowed us to be successful. And so the quantification is there within the process. Again, more in the cost and revenue from the nature of semiconductors. That's where it really resides. But that's the quantification part. And then in terms of the customer of choice, again, our technology allows us to get that level of feedback from our suppliers. They know when we hold these reviews and we do the scoring, it's not there to simply just beat up a supplier. It's truly about collaboration. It's truly to recognize where they're doing well and thank them and reward them for that in terms of score, if nothing else. It's to understand collectively where things are not doing as well, get the feedback, put those continuous improvement plans in place that allow them to improve there. So we get a lot of really positive feedback from our suppliers about the process, about it proves to be effective. We hear a lot from new stakeholders, new VPs that join the company, and I personally received a lot of feedback about how we run this process and how it is a benchmark. We believe that what we do and work with the suppliers allows us to really, us as a procurement team, differentiate what we do in this space. So it's not a quantification. It's not, we don't ask them to let's score ourselves, but it's a lot of feedback, and we listen. We'll listen to our stakeholders, we'll listen to our suppliers, and we're always looking to how we can improve the process.
Excellent, Gary. And so innovation, we've talked about the upside, but we'd be remiss in the area of supplier management if we didn't deal with the potential for downside in the area of supplier risk. So again, I got a top 10 list here. David Letterman's gone, but here's a top 10. And not surprisingly, a variety of risks. This one comes from Hackett as well. Whether they're sort of environmental, geopolitical risks, changes in the supply base through M&A and all those kinds of things. Lots of different risks to track what risk events do you monitor, and what steps can you take when you identify potential risk to help mitigate it?
Thanks, Richard. So again, from a direct space, really, the risk events of highest concern are those which have the potential to impact supply. So things like such as environmental disasters and social responsibility, they're two of the highest risks, and they're captured in the annual risk assessment, which I spoke of previously, that we do in the direct space for our strategic and our transformational suppliers. And indirect, a lot of our spends across IT categories. We're a high-tech company with a lot of IP. So our high areas of concern are things like on here, cyber attacks, data security. One of our key mitigation strategies is in our contracting language, and it's not only with things like indemnification and liability, but we need language with relevant extra clauses whenever disaster occurs. So those are the type of things that we do. Again, kind of different between direct and indirect, but those are the things that we focus on from a supplier risk perspective.
Excellent. And I know just in the few minutes we have left, just wanted to share a few other thoughts. One is, that the fact that despite that these risk management challenges are out there, many organizations do find it difficult to get resources and budget allocated to address these kind of tasks. So in a Hackett report here on supply risk management, for example, the most common lament here was procurement's usually held responsible but doesn't get the mandate or resources. And that's in spite of the fact that procurement ROI for organizations that have formalized supplier risk assessment is significantly higher than other organizations. So just a challenge to deal with there. Interesting to look then at how are supply management resources allocated. And it's interesting to note that world-class organizations actually allocate fewer total FTEs per billion of spend because of the efficiencies they've gotten. But when it comes to the area of supplier risk management that we're just discussing now, they actually allocate significantly more resources, about 6.5 times more resources for top performers versus the lowest performers. So overall, they've gotten efficiencies and been able to streamline their headcount, their staff from a procurement standpoint. The staff that they have, they allocate more proportionally to supply risk management. So interesting perspective there as well. And just to close today, I just wanted to give you kind of a vision for the future, both from the buying organization and the supplier standpoint of how technology can enable this collaborative experience. So think for a second about a QBR, a quarterly business review, usually exhaustive efforts to pull together lots of data about how is a supplier doing in the various ways that they touch your business. So imagine for a second going into a QBR and having on your smartphone device actually all the information about a supplier right at your fingertips. How much spend do we have with them? Do we have sourcing projects or RFPs in process? What's their transactional volumes? What contracts do we have active? And on the supplier side as well, giving them better visibility. So at one place, the supplier could see what are the different activities I have going on with you as a customer, be able to look at my performance, as you were mentioning, Garry, track that supplier scorecard results, get visibility to working capital and cash flow. When am I going to get paid, for example? Really helps to get supplier engagement involved as well. So that was everything we had. I had a chance to ask many questions of our expert, Garry, today, and I really appreciate the input. And know that we had so much content to cover today, we may not have much time for audience questions today, but you have our contact information here as well. We're both happy to follow up to any more detailed questions that you may have for us to respond to from the session today as well. So, John, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to thank Richard and Garry for an informative web seminar today. All questions submitted during the program will be answered via email. Attendees of this event will receive an email in the next 24 hours thanking them for attending today's web seminar. This email will contain the link to your CEH certificate. And we thank you for attending today, and have a great rest of your morning or afternoon.